The autumn evening in Cresthaven carried a chill that seeped through the cracks of old windows and settled into the bones of those who lingered too long outdoors. The town's main street, a charming stretch of cobblestones lined with quaint shops and glowing street lamps, hummed with the quiet rhythm of a small community easing into the night. The air smelled of fallen leaves, distant wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of baked goods from the bakery 2 doors down. At the heart of this picturesque scene stood the Gilded Hearth, a restaurant that gleamed like a jewel in Cresthaven's crown. Its frosted glass doors reflected the aspirations of the town's elite, its polished oak tables and candlelit ambiance a testament to its exclusivity. The Gilded Hearth was a place where appearances mattered, where wealth and status were unspoken currencies, and where the unwritten rules of entry were as rigid as the starched uniforms of its staff. Eldora Mayhew, 78 years old, shuffled toward the restaurant, her worn canvas shoes scuffing softly against the uneven cobblestones. Her coat, a faded green relic from decades past, hung loosely on her frail frame, its hem frayed from years of use, its buttons mismatched from countless repairs. In her gnarled hands, she clutched a small cloth purse, its seams stitched and restitched with meticulous care, a testament to her frugality and resilience. Her silver hair, tied back in a loose bun, framed a face etched with deep lines, lines that spoke of laughter, sorrow, and a life lived in the shadows of others' stories. Eldora's hazel eyes, though dimmed by age, held a quiet determination, a spark that refused to be extinguished despite the weight of years. She had come to celebrate. Not a birthday or an anniversary, but something far more personal. A promise kept to herself after decades of sacrifice. Tonight was the night she would finally sit at a proper table, order a meal she didn't cook, and feel, for once, like she belonged somewhere other than the margins of her own existence. She had saved for months, tucking away coins and crumpled bills from her meager pension, dreaming of a single evening where she could taste the luxury others took for granted. The Gilded Hearth, with its reputation for elegance, was her chosen destination, a place where she could honor a vow made long ago to a little girl who had once called her Mama. As Eldora approached the restaurant's entrance, the doorman, a young man named Trevor with a starched uniform and a practiced smile, stepped forward, blocking her path before she could touch the brass handle. His eyes flicked over her coat, her shoes, her purse, and his smile faltered, replaced by a thin line of judgment. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, his voice clipped, polished with the rehearsed politeness of someone trained to keep the undesirables out. "We have a dress code here. I don't think you're suited for the Gilded Hearth." Eldora paused, her hand still reaching for the door, her fingers trembling slightly. The words hit her like a gust of cold wind, sharp and unexpected. "I've got money," she said softly, her voice steady but laced with a tremor of hurt. She opened her purse, revealing a small roll of bills, carefully folded and secured with a rubber band. "I just want a meal." Trevor's face hardened, his gaze darting to the side as if embarrassed to be seen speaking to her. "It's not about money," he said, his tone sharper now, impatient. "It's about standards. You understand." A small crowd had gathered near the entrance, patrons in tailored coats and polished shoes, their laughter fading as they watched the exchange. Eldora felt their eyes on her, each glance a pinprick against her resolve, each whisper a reminder of her place in their world. She opened her mouth to speak, to explain, to plead her case, but the words caught in her throat, tangled in the weight of their scrutiny. Instead, she nodded once, a small, defeated gesture, and turned away. her shoes scuffing against the cobblestones as she shuffled back into the night, her purse clutched tighter than before. Inside the gilded hearth, the hum of conversation resumed, the clink of glasses and the murmur of self-important voices filling the void left by Eldora's departure. Trevor adjusted his tie, avoiding the mirrored reflection of himself in the frosted glass door. He told himself it was just policy, nothing personal. He had a job to do, standards to uphold. But the weight of Eldora's retreating figure stayed with him, a quiet accusation he couldn't shake. He pushed it down, turning his attention to the next group of patrons, well-dressed, confident, the kind of people who belonged. Outside, Eldora walked slowly, her breath visible in the chilly air. The street lamps cast long shadows, stretching her small frame into something larger, almost defiant. She didn't cry, though her eyes burned with the threat of tears. She didn't curse or rage, though her heart pounded with a mix of shame and anger. Instead, she walked, one step at a time, back to the life she knew. A life where doors, like the Gilded Hearth's, were rarely open to people like her. Eldora's home was a small cottage at the edge of Crest Haven, tucked behind a sagging wooden fence overgrown with rose bushes that hadn't bloomed in years. The paint on the cottage peeled in long, curling strips, and the roof leaked during heavy rains, leaving stains on the ceiling like abstract maps of her struggles. The porch creaked under her weight as she climbed the steps, her key turning in the lock with a familiar groan. Inside, the air was warm but heavy, scented with the faint mustiness of old wood and the lingering aroma of lavender from a sachet she kept on the windowsill. The cottage was sparse, furnished with the bare essentials: a single chair by a rickety table, a narrow bed with a patched quilt, a stove that took too long to heat. On the table sat a chipped teacup, its handle worn smooth from years of use, and a stack of yellowed letters tied with a faded ribbon. Eldora sank into the chair, her purse still in her lap, her fingers tracing the worn fabric, as if it held the answers she sought. She opened it and pulled out a crumpled photograph, its edges soft from years of handling. The image showed a young girl, no older than 10, with Eldora's hazel eyes and a smile that hadn't yet learned the world's cruelty. Her daughter, Lila, gone now for 30 years, lost to a fever that no amount of Eldora's love, prayers, or sleepless nights could cure. Tonight was supposed to be for Lila. Eldora had made a promise, whispered in the dark of a hospital room as Lila's small hand grew cold in hers. "One day, sweetheart," she'd said, "I'll live a moment just for joy, for you." The Gilded Hearth was meant to be that moment, a place where, for one evening, Eldora could feel like more than the sum of her losses, more than the woman who scrubbed floors, mended clothes, and cared for others while her own dreams withered. She set the photograph down and stared at the wall, where a small calendar hung, its pages marked with the days she'd spent alone. Each mark was a quiet victory, a testament to her survival, but also a reminder of how little had changed. The rejection at the restaurant stung, not because of the food or the ambiance, but because it echoed every door that had been closed to her. Every job she wasn't qualified for, every neighbor who looked away, every dream she'd buried to keep going. She'd been a seamstress, stitching dresses for women who never knew her name. She'd been a cleaner, wiping down offices while executives discussed deals she'd never understand. She'd been a caregiver, tending to the elderly and the sick, her kindness a currency that never seemed to buy her own freedom. Eldora wasn't one to wallow. She stood, her knees creaking, and moved to the stove, lighting it with a match that trembled in her hand. She prepared a simple meal: bread, a slice of cheese, a cup of tea brewed from leaves she'd used twice before. As she ate, her mind churned, replaying Trevor's words, the crowd's stares, the weight of their judgment. She wasn't angry, not yet, but something inside her shifted, a spark of defiance that hadn't burned in years. It was small, fragile, but undeniable. A whisper that said she deserved more than this. She finished her meal and washed the teacup, her hands moving with the muscle memory of routine. Then she sat again, pulling a scrap of paper and a stub of pencil from a drawer. In careful, looping script, she wrote, "Kindness costs nothing." The words felt right, like a prayer or a promise. She folded the paper and tucked it into her purse, her resolve hardening like clay in a kiln. Tomorrow, she decided, she would go back. Not to beg or plead, but to be seen. The next evening, the Gilded Hearth was busier than usual, its tables filled with Cresthaven's power players. A local election was approaching, and the restaurant had become a hub for whispered deals and polished smiles. The air inside was thick with the scent of roasted lamb, red wine, and the faint perfume of ambition. Waiters glided between tables, their trays laden with dishes that cost more than Eldora's weekly grocery budget. The chandelier overhead cast a warm glow, but it did little to soften the cold undercurrent of exclusivity that defined the place. Mayor Corinne Vale entered the restaurant with her aide Marcus, a young man with a quick smile and a notebook always in hand. Corinne, in her 50s, carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd earned her place. Her sharp eyes missed nothing, and her reputation for fairness had made her a beloved, if sometimes polarizing, figure in Cresthaven. She hadn't been born into wealth. She'd grown up on the same side of town as Eldora, in a house just as modest, where the floors creaked and the pipes groaned. Her father, a factory worker, had taught her the value of dignity, a lesson she carried into the mayor's office, where she fought for the underdog while navigating the expectations of the elite. Corinne wore a simple navy blazer, her only concession to formality, a silver pin shaped like a crescent moon, a gift from her father, who'd died before she won her first election. She settled at a corner table, her back to the wall, a habit from years of needing to watch her surroundings. Marcus sat across from her, flipping open his notebook to review the day's agenda. The evening was meant to be a break, a chance to unwind before the campaign trail intensified. But Corinne's instincts, honed by years of reading people, told her something was off. She noticed Trevor, the doorman, fidgeting by the entrance, his hands adjusting his tie, his eyes darting to the windows. His unease was subtle, but to Corinne, it was a signal, like a crack in a dam. Before she could ask, a waiter approached with menus, and the moment passed. The evening proceeded, small talk, a glass of wine, the clink of glasses as deals were toasted. But Corinne's attention kept drifting to the door, to Trevor's nervous glances, to the world beyond the frosted glass. Outside, Eldora stood across the street, hidden in the shadow of a lamppost. She hadn't planned to return, but the spark from the night before had grown into a quiet resolve, a fire that warmed her against the autumn chill. She wore the same faded coat, the same worn shoes, but in her hands was the scrap of paper, now taped to a piece of cardboard to form a small sign. "Kindness costs nothing." The words were bold, written in black ink, each letter a declaration of her right to exist, to be seen. She held the sign up, her arms trembling not from weakness, but from the weight of her own courage. Passers-by glanced at her, some with pity, others with discomfort. a few with curiosity. A young couple whispered, their words carried away by the evening breeze. An older man paused, read the sign, and shook his head before hurrying on. Eldora didn't care. For the first time in years, she felt alive, her heart beating with a purpose she'd almost forgotten. She wasn't here to shame anyone, not even Trevor. She was here to remind them, and herself, that she was more than her clothes, more than her poverty, more than the sum of her losses. Inside the Gilded Hearth, Marcus noticed the small crowd gathering outside, their faces lit by the glow of their phones. He stepped to the window, his brow furrowing as he read Eldora's sign. "Mayor," he said, tapping Corinne's shoulder, his voice low but urgent. "You might want to see this." Corinne joined him, her gaze settling on Eldora, who stood alone across the street, her sign held high. The old woman's face was illuminated by the street lamp, her expression calm but unyielding, her hazel eyes bright with a quiet strength. Corinne's heart sank. She knew that look, the look of someone who'd been pushed too far, too often, who'd found the courage to push back. She'd seen it in her father's eyes when he fought for better wages, in her own reflection when she ran for mayor against a tide of skepticism. "Excuse me," Corinne said to her table, standing abruptly. Her heels clicked against the polished oak floor as she crossed the restaurant, her blazer catching the light of the chandelier. She pushed open the frosted glass door and stepped into the chilly night, the crowd parting as she approached Eldora. The air was thick with tension, the murmurs of onlookers mingling with the rustle of leaves skittering across the cobblestones. "Ma'am," Corinne said gently, her voice cutting through the noise, "what happened here?" Eldora lowered her sign slightly, her eyes meeting Corinne's. There was no anger in her gaze, only a quiet resolve that made Corinne's chest tighten. "They told me I didn't belong," Eldora said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Said my clothes weren't good enough. I just wanted a meal. I had the money, but they wouldn't let me in." Corinne's jaw tightened, her eyes flicking to Trevor, who had followed her outside, his face pale under the street lamp. "Is this true?" she asked, her voice low but laced with authority. Trevor stammered, his hands twisting together. It's policy, Mayor. We have a dress code. It's not personal. We have standards to maintain. Not personal." Corinne's voice was sharp now, cutting through the night like a blade. "You looked at this woman, judged her worth by her coat, and turned her away. That's as personal as it gets, Trevor." The crowd murmured, phones appearing as people began to record, their screens glowing like fireflies. Trevor's eyes darted to the cameras, his composure crumbling under the weight of their scrutiny. "I was just doing my job," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Corinne ignored him and turned back to Eldora, her expression softening. "What's your name?" "Eldora Mayhew," she said, her voice soft but clear, each syllable a small act of defiance. "Eldora," Corinne said, her tone warm, like a hand extended in friendship. "Would you like to join me for dinner?" The crowd fell silent, the air heavy with anticipation. Eldora blinked, her sign lowering further, her fingers tightening around the cardboard. "I don't want charity," she said, her voice firm despite the tears glistening in her eyes. "It's not charity," Corinne replied, stepping closer. "It's respect. You deserve to be here, Eldora. Let me show you that." Eldora hesitated, her gaze searching Corinne's face for any hint of pity or pretense. Finding none, she nodded once. A small, decisive gesture. Corinne offered her arm, and Eldora took it, her touch light but steady. Together, they walked toward the restaurant's entrance, the crowd parting like a sea. Trevor stepped aside, his face flushed with shame, his hands shoved into his pockets. The frosted glass doors opened, and the warmth of the gilded hearth enveloped them, a stark contrast to the cold judgment Eldora had faced the night before. Inside, the diners watched, their forks paused mid-air, their conversations stilled. Some stared openly, others averted their eyes, uncomfortable with the disruption of their carefully curated world. Corinne led Eldora to her table, pulling out a chair with a gentleness that belied her fierce resolve. "Sit," she said, her voice both an invitation and a command. Eldora sat, her purse in her lap, her hands trembling as she took in the scene, the crystal glasses, the flickering candles, the faces watching her with a mix of curiosity and unease. Marcus smiled warmly, sliding a menu across the table to Eldora. "Order whatever you like," he said, his voice bright with encouragement. "It's on the mayor." The waitstaff, caught off guard by the mayor's actions, scrambled to set an extra place, their movements quick but careful, as if afraid to break the fragile moment. Eldora opened the menu, the prices blurring before her eyes, each number a reminder of the world she'd been excluded from. She wasn't used to this, being seen, being heard, being treated as if she mattered. But Corinne's presence grounded her, a steady anchor in a sea of uncertainty. "What do you recommend?" Eldora asked, her voice soft, almost shy. Corinne leaned forward, her eyes warm. "The roasted chicken is excellent, but I have a feeling you'd like the vegetable risotto. It's hearty, comforting, like home, but fancier." Eldora smiled, a small, genuine curve of her lips. "Risotto, then," she said, and the waiter nodded, jotting it down with a deference he hadn't shown the night before. As they waited for the food, Eldora began to talk, her words slow at first, then flowing like a river breaking through a dam. She spoke of Lila, her daughter, who'd loved to draw and sing, whose laughter had filled the cottage until the fever took her. She spoke of the years spent caring for a sick child, of the nights spent praying for a miracle that never came, of the jobs that barely paid, seamstress, cleaner, caregiver, each one a step toward survival, but never toward freedom. She spoke of the cottage, her sanctuary, and her prison, where every creak of the floorboards reminded her of the life she'd lost and the life she'd kept living. Corinne listened, her food untouched, her eyes never leaving Eldora's face. Marcus took notes, not for work, but because he couldn't help it. Eldora's story was a map of a life too many ignored, a tapestry of pain and resilience that demanded to be remembered. The other diners watched, some with curiosity, others with discomfort. Their whispers a soft undercurrent to Eldora's words. One man, a local businessman named Harold Vance, leaned toward his companion and muttered, This is a stunt. She's playing to the cameras outside." Corinne's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. She stood, her chair scraping against the floor, her voice carrying across the room with the weight of her authority. "If anyone here thinks kindness is a stunt, I invite you to look at yourself. Eldora Mayhew isn't here for your approval. She's here because she deserves to be. Because every person in this town deserves a seat at the table, no matter their clothes or their past." Harold shrank back, his face red, his wineglass trembling in his hand. The room was silent, the weight of Corinne's words settling over everyone like a blanket. Eldora looked at her, a tear slipping down her cheek, catching the candlelight. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible but heavy with meaning. Corinne sat, her hand reaching across the table to squeeze Eldora's. "You don't need to thank me," she said. "You did this. You stood up. I'm just following your lead." The meal arrived, and they ate, the clink of cutlery a soft counterpoint to their conversation. Eldora savored each bite of the risotto, its warmth spreading through her like a memory of Lila's laughter. For the first time in years, she felt whole, as if the pieces of her broken life had been stitched back together, if only for this one evening. The next morning, Cresthaven was abuzz. Videos of Eldora's stand and Corinne's response had spread across social media, shared by locals and picked up by regional news outlets. The hashtag #StartKindnessCosts. Nothing trended, alongside grainy footage of Eldora's sign and Corinne's fierce words to Trevor. The Gilded Hearth issued a public apology, posted on their website and pinned to their door, promising to revise their dress code and train their staff on inclusivity. Trevor was suspended, not out of malice, but as a chance to reflect, to unlearn the habits that had led him to judge a woman by her coat. Trevor spent the day at home, replaying the moment he'd turned Eldora away, the shame growing heavier with each memory. He thought of his own mother, who'd worked 2 jobs to keep him fed, who'd worn the same dress to every parent-teacher meeting because it was all she had. He hadn't meant to hurt Eldora, but he saw now how his actions had echoed a larger cruelty, one he'd been too busy to notice. He wrote a letter to her, his handwriting shaky, promising to do better, to be better. Eldora's cottage saw visitors for the first time in years. Neighbors brought casseroles, flowers, apologies for years of silence. A local tailor, a woman named Marla, who had once mended Eldora's coat for free, offered to make her a new one, no charge. "Something blue," Marla said, "to match the sky." Eldora accepted the gestures with grace, her hazel eyes bright with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. She wasn't used to this, people seeing her, caring for her, treating her as more than a shadow. The most meaningful gesture came that afternoon, delivered by Marcus in the form of a letter from Corinne. It read, "Eldora, you reminded me why I do this work. Cresthaven is better because of you. If you'll allow it, I'd like to help repair your home. New roof, fresh paint, whatever you need. No charity. Just neighbors helping neighbors." Eldora sat with the letter, her fingers tracing the words, her heart full. She thought of Lila, of the promise she'd kept, and of the spark that had brought her back to the Gilded Hearth. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not as an old woman in a worn coat, but as Eldora Mayhew, a person with a story worth hearing, a life worth celebrating. Weeks later, the Gilded Hearth hosted a community dinner, free to all, regardless of attire. The frosted glass doors were propped open, welcoming everyone from Cresthaven's wealthiest to its humblest. Eldora sat at the head table, her new blue coat draped over her shoulders, its color a vibrant contrast to the faded green she'd worn before. Corinne was there, her crescent moon pin glinting in the candlelight, her smile warm as she raised a glass to the room. Marcus sat beside her, his notebook replaced by a plate of food, his laughter mingling with the chatter of the crowd. Even Trevor was there, quieter now, his eyes meeting Eldora's with a nod of respect, a silent promise to keep learning. The dinner was loud, messy, human. Children ran between tables, their laughter echoing off the oak-paneled walls. Elders shared stories, their voices weaving a tapestry of Cresthaven's past. Strangers became neighbors, their differences softened by the simple act of breaking bread together. Eldora looked around, her heart swelling with a joy she hadn't felt since Lila was alive. She'd come to the Gilded Hearth seeking a moment of joy, but she'd found something greater, a reminder that kindness, when given freely, could change a town, a heart, a life. As the evening drew to a close, Corinne stood, her glass raised high. "To Eldora," she said, her voice clear and strong, "who showed us that courage doesn't need a new coat, just a steady heart." The room erupted in applause, the sound washing over Eldora like a warm tide. She smiled, her hazel eyes bright with tears, her hands steady for the first time in years. She thought of Lila, of the promise kept, and of the truth she'd always known but had nearly forgotten. Kindness and respect go beyond appearances. They were the threads that bound a community, the spark that could light even the darkest corners. And in that moment, Eldora Mayhew felt whole, not just for herself, but for every person who'd ever been turned away, judged, or forgotten. She'd stood up, and in doing so, she'd changed Cresthaven. She'd changed herself, and that, she knew, was a victory worth celebrating.